Kate.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Maxman, and I am the managing partner of the DC office of Cohen & Gresser. And I'm pleased to welcome you to Cohen & Gresser's webinar, Preparing an International Legislative Strategy. Cohen & Gresser is an international law firm, and we are pleased to have with us today both my colleagues in our London and in our DC offices. The point of this webinar is to discuss a number of international policy initiatives going back as far as this past summer's G7 summit. With me today from our DC office is Adam Bramwell, who is the chair of our government relations practice. He's based in Washington, DC, and he is a seasoned political professional with over 25 years of senior Capitol Hill experience. He most recently, before we were lucky enough to have him join us, was the chief of staff to Senator Chris Coons, and he was general counsel to the Secretary of the Senate and served as counsel to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Ethics. He is also a practicing lawyer with extensive knowledge of congressional ethics process. So Adam, do you want to say hello?
Hi, thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for having me. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you, guests, invitees, friends of the webinar, much appreciated. I'm happy to shepherd and open up the government relations practice at Cohen & Gresser. We take pride in our being nimble and adept at kind of the four facets or four different boxes of government relations: protect, advance, inform, and shape. We love to protect a client's interests and look out for opportunities to where clients may be either threatened or where there may be adverse consequences for what Washington and the world is doing, whether in regard to taxes or regulations. We want to be able to advance or forward clients' interests in whether it be tax or regulatory schemes or opportunities for funding. And we're also, as kind of the point of government relations, to be able to inform clients' capabilities, to inform clients about what's happening in Washington, what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, how we forecast, what happened yesterday, a quick analysis, so that clients are aware of the full body or full scope of Washington and to bring expertise to the table. And then the other aspect of government relations is shaping a client's profile. Whether introducing a client to Washington, whether if a client wants to be introduced to Washington, to further or increase a client's profile, or to try and diminish, shape their profile, or manage their profile in Washington, to increase or decrease it based upon the politics of the times and based upon the policies of the times. And that's generally a broad description of government relations practice, which I'm happy with the support and backing of Cohen & Gresser to be the chair of. And I'll pass the baton back to Melissa for further webinaring in this Zoom. Thank you again.
Thank you, Adam. Next, I'm going to turn the table over to Jeff Bronheim. Jeff is the managing partner of our London office, and he will introduce the UK portion of our panelists, and then he'll come back to me and I'll set some ground rules. So Jeff, you're muted. Jeff, you're muted.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's pretty easy for me to introduce my fellow panelist, Miriam Gonzalez-Durantes, which I'll get to in a second. When we founded this office here about 4 years ago, first person I wanted to get was Miriam, because her and I share a kind of a love-hate relationship with British politics, deeply embedded in it for some time. Miriam worked at the EU for a number of years in Brussels, so has real good inside information on how that works there. After that, she practiced as an international trade expert in the UK for many years, in addition, was married to the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, which gave her real kind of personal and deep insight into how policies are made and the personalities that go into making them and shaping them. And I think often that perceptiveness of the people and how they think and what is applicable to them is just as important as stated government policy. And Miriam gives a good angle on that. The last thing I would say is, Melissa said we're kind of starting from the G7, but in fact, in these international trade matters, nothing just starts. One thing flows from a previous thing, which flowed from something else. Then you have political change, then you have other activities. In the UK, obviously, the famous Brexit has driven most everything in one way or another, and the politics associated with that. And we're still feeling the ramifications and how that plays out, both internationally and with Europe. So I just think that by today, we're trying to give both kind of Adam a Mr. Inside in Washington's view, and Miriam a Ms. Inside and Outside in the UK view, and maybe combined that will help us shape some thinking of the likely trends in international issues that are relevant for us.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. And I lead the trade practice in COINGRESR, the international trade practice, very much focusing on international agreements and on the European Union, and advice to clients on European Union developments and regulatory steps. But perhaps it would be useful if we start having the view you rightly focus on the G7, how important that was and how much has it changed the agenda, and we can then look at the US side and start the discussion and focus on questions, which would be the interesting bit. But from the European side, the G7 has been seen as a milestone. So it's a moment in international trade relations, and in particular on the transatlantic trade relationship, that has changed with the G7. The G7 in many respects in July was very much another meeting. So there were bits and pieces that went in the right direction, like the agreement for the minimum corporate tax. There were others that didn't go in the right direction, like the measures that countries and civil society wanted to take in terms of limiting coal. So that is typical. That happens pretty much in every meeting of this kind. What was not typical was to see a very, very different rhetoric and narrative coming from the US in relation to China. So that feeling that we started having a kind of Cold War language, which created a gap between the US position and the EU position. And no matter how many efforts both sides made at the meeting in July to seem that they were all together, it was the end of the Trump era, it was the beginning of a better stage in the transatlantic relations. That really put there the marker for what we have seen since July, which is the fact that the US is moving towards a strategy of confrontation with China, while the EU is very much on a strategy of accommodation with China. What we have seen going further has been variation of that very same theme. There were some bits and pieces that had happened earlier, and both sides are recriminating each other as to why this is getting in the wrong direction, this transatlantic relationship. It is true that the European Union had taken the very awkward step to announce an investment agreement with China just shortly after Biden took office, and it was unprecedented to announce that kind of agreement. It wasn't even a properly worked out agreement, so they announced a kind of halfway house. They never do that, so it was very clearly a provocation. But from the US side, there have been provocations as well. The exit from Afghanistan without doing it in a coordinated manner with the EU, and very much it has been all over the media. The AUKUS pact kind of moving Australia away from the agreements with France without giving any prior notice. And if one didn't know the team of Biden, one would think that these things simply happen and one makes mistakes in foreign policy. Blinken is obviously a very experienced player, and it is very difficult to think that some of this would not have happened on purpose, because they know well, and they have been there in previous administrations, they know how these kind of things are done. This is only reinforcing from the European point of view, this is reinforcing the view that Europe needs strategic autonomy, is how France puts it, but basically to depend less from the US in its security. But it is also reinforcing the view, which is very much led by France and Germany, that the EU cannot afford to go into confrontation with China and has to play kind of midway between the US and China. It is interesting that things are coming to this point, because actually if you dig deeper in the position of European Union member states, things are not as clear. So there is quite a lot of concern about the dependence on China on critical goods. There is concern also about what China is doing with some of the immediate neighbors of the EU, with Africa and some traditional allies like Latin American countries. There is a lot of concern about having to vet the investments from China and not letting China take over investment in strategic sectors in the EU. But what you can see, which is quite remarkable, is that the view on accommodating to China really runs through all the political lines. So if you look at all the polls, you can see that no matter the political party, pretty much Europe is moving in that direction. We don't really know what the effect of the German elections would be on this. Germany has traditionally softened the differences between the EU and the US on some of these big discussions, but it's a bit early to know who is going to be commanding the German government. I should stress that under all this, a lot of positive work goes on. So this week, for example, there is a meeting in terms of between the USTR and the US government at working level and the EU, trying to look at the digital economy and the regulation on digital, and some really important issues that we can discuss later on if you wish, on data, for example, and the data privacy shield. So that work goes on, but there is definitely a period of difficulties that has started, and it's very difficult to see how this may land in a more positive direction. Adam, it would be useful to see whether from the US side that is that mirrors the concern, or whether perhaps things are seen very differently.
Well, thank you, Miriam. That's a perfect segue or connection from how things are viewed on this side of the pond, so to speak. Since the campaign, the Biden administration and the Biden folk have wanted to shift their attention from to the east instead of the west. This policy is completely built around how to compete and counter China. Under the Trump administration, it was widely seen that it was the policy was confrontation. And as I think chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Menendez said, confrontation in and of itself is not a policy. It's based on both competition and confrontation, both. And that strategy is based on really three premises. One, the world is interconnected. And two, the world is divided between democratic and autocratic camps. And three, the above two premises are tied together in and of themselves, that the world is interconnected and you have divisions between democratic and autocratic camps. So how does the US navigate that in the perspective of competing and confronting China? There's also the recognition that countries generally want to do business with China and undertake commerce with China, as I think Miriam so noted, but would prefer to be under the security umbrella of the United States. So you have that tension of commerce versus national security. Then you have the overriding theme of climate change, which is the overriding theme of driving, or the overriding policy driving Biden foreign policy, which is climate change. And you'll note that COP26 the international climate change policy that gets in Scotland at the end of October, beginning of November, will be of highly valued importance to the United States. And I believe the US is going to send a high-level delegation over to Scotland for COP26. So that's kind of the macro. And then you get to the strategic themes of how does the US implement those premises. And the first is you have to look inward to turn outward. So investing in America and its people, building back better. So that's kind of the first tactical theme in the strategic approach. The other is upholding US values and not letting China monopolize those values. The third is multilateralism. And I know Miriam and I have different viewpoints on multilateralism. And the fourth is not letting China fill the vacuum in world leadership. We can take these bit by bit, but since the focus on this is on international legislative strategy, I'll focus more on kind of the legislative aspects of it. In that respect, the Biden administration and the Democratic platform believes we must be stronger to compete domestically in order to compete internationally. Stronger domestic to be able to be the leader on the world stage. Or we can build back better for ourselves inwardly and to be outwardly. Nevertheless, there are countless domestic challenges to what's happening now. As you can no doubt know, Washington is in the immediate sausage factory of legislation. DC has lots on its plate right now, and the Democrats have only a 3-seat margin of error in the House, and the Senate's tied 50-50, so there really is no margin of error. So what's going on right now? Funding the government funding expires December 30th. We have the debt ceiling, which can the US fulfill its debt obligations, the full faith and credit of the United States. And then there's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is about $557 billion, most of which is allegedly paid for. The Democrats' $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, and not to mention that highway funding and flood insurance, which are two major issues, expire Thursday evening. Then you have in the background, going to kind of my second strategic aims in the United States about values. In the background, on the mid burner, you have voting rights, immigration, choice, a women's right to choose, and police reform at the national level. That's the micro. What's the situation right now? Janet Yellen just sent, the Secretary of the Treasury just sent a note. This is breaking news as of about an hour or two ago, just sent a note to Senate leadership that the debt ceiling would be reached on October 18th. Rights and ICAP, which is an independent think tank that Treasury and the Capitol Hill generally goes to about Treasury securities, projects the debt ceiling will somewhere fall between mid-October to October 25th. And then if the debt ceiling is not raised and we reach that limit, the Treasury Department will have to pay invoices essentially based on what's available on incoming receipts, which is generally in the $50 to $300 billion a day range, but it's unpredictable. Obviously, debt would come first, and then what do you pay second, third, fourth? We've never gotten to that point before. Majority Leader Schumer in the House, Majority Leader Schumer in the Senate has offered motions to fund the government to December 10th with a commensurate debt limit increase. The Republicans objected. Republican leader McConnell has said, let's fund the government until December 10th with no debt limit increase, and the Democrats objected. So what's going to happen now, since both sides are not budging yet? Both are pretty adamant that there'll be the government will be funded and there'll be a debt limit increase. The Democrats can pass a separate only quote unquote reconciliation bill, which more sausage making, but essentially there's a 2-week time lag between the Democrats introducing a bill and the debt ceiling being raised. So work back from October 18th, the Janet Yellen date, you have till really the middle or end of next week for the Democrats to introduce their own separate path. That, and there'll be a short-term, if you're a golfer, short-term putts to keep the government open through December 10th. And then there may be another one and another one until there's what's called an omnibus or a master continuing resolution, continuing the government to the end of the next fiscal year. Then you have the both bipartisan bills, trying to speak quickly because I know my time for monologuing is short. both bipartisan, the bipartisan bill, Speaker Pelosi has said that'll come up for a vote on Thursday. Speaker Pelosi is marshaling her votes. The progressive wing of the party is against the bill or is trying to use it as leverage to get the moderates on board for the big Democrats only bill. This is an outcome that nobody knows as of yet. The president started to work the phones also with Speaker Pelosi in trying to get the big vote on Thursday to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That's combined, assuming the Democrats have a framework for their own bill, the $3.5 trillion infrastructure Build Back Better bill, which should be, they're working on a framework to be announced on Thursday. So the bipartisan bill and the Democratic framework, to get back to my master point, that those two bills will be leaning forward and to quote unquote build back better to compete and counter China. And that's kind of what's happening on the floor of the Senate and the House right now in hopefully 9 minutes or less. And thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Jeff and Melissa for questions, and happy to answer any questions.
I do want to encourage everyone to please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A in the audience. There's a lot to dig into, and we want to get a dialogue going. We don't want this to be a bunch of talking heads. So please, please feel free to insert your questions, and we'll make sure that both of our experts can respond. There's a lot to talk about. Miriam, how does the European Union see the looming debt crisis in the United States? Because obviously it would have global ramifications.
I am afraid it's a good question, Melissa, because I think that there is very little awareness in Europe of the implications of the discussion on the debt ceiling. And part of the reason why that happens is that from the European side, it looks like if some of these discussions keep reoccurring, that from time to time there is a big hiccup in Washington, and it looks like if everything is going to collapse, but somehow things manage to sort out themselves. And of course, the US and still the most powerful country in the world is not going to be in a situation where the whole system of governance is paralyzed. So there is really no nervousness even, or I would take it further, as I said earlier, even awareness of the ramifications that this could have. And Europe is very much focusing on the next stages. I mean, from the European point of view, there are two big issues, three probably big issues on the table: environment, tech. So, and on tech is quite interesting that in relation to the US, I think that there is a very different tone, much more conciliatory tone towards the tech companies happening right now in Brussels. Interestingly, as some of the regulation on tech companies is going through the European Parliament, which is when you normally expect that that the EU is going to be much more aggressive. So that is going in the right direction, but it's environment, tech, and relations with the UK that perhaps we can talk about later, because things are moving a little bit. And obviously whatever the US does with the UK has enormous repercussions on Europe. But those are the main areas of worry for the EU. They are not looking at the debt ceiling with a lot of concern, I think.
I take it that it's because it's like Peter and the Wolf. You know, they've heard this before, and everybody gets very upset, and we always seem to work it out.
We do,
Yeah,
but
it seems like a recurrent cycle, but it sort of goes away without having to do very much about it from the international side.
What were you going to say?
We do, but the last time we reached the cliff, the market fell 7% in one day. So there was a mini panic the last time we reached the cliff. So I think that was in 2007 or 2009. I forgot which day. So it always works out, but when Wall Street wakes up, it's quite a minute there where Wall Street gulps and needs either a lot of Excedrin or Pepto-Bismol, so to speak. So.
That is very correct. I guess that from the European and actually the international point of view, when you have gone through a whole year of pandemic, that markets have been up and down for lots of different reasons, the worry about spikes has become much less, of course.
So I'll add something kind of from the British view, and we saw this with the submarine deal. I was with a general last week who used to head the UK military. And of course, the UK is quite close to the US on the military side. He actually says that him and his fellow military people are terrified that the US is going to abandon the kind of position of keeping all the Europeans more or less together that they've held for 60 years, right? And hopefully it's okay, but already we see France is so mad. Will Europe actually kind of disintegrate in a NATO context? That's something that actually is scary to them. It's one thing to focus on China, but to kind of leave your other people just to fend for themselves seems a risk in and of itself.
If I can comment on that, because I think that is a very real worry, and that is how it is being perceived from the EU. In the EU, there have been endless discussions about the creation of a security and foreign policy capability. As you know, it has been on the French agenda for decades, and they never managed to get it, and they could not get it if the UK was still part of the European Union. But this is the very first time that you see many other member states starting to move in the French direction, precisely because there is this feeling that the US, probably for very legitimate reasons, is saying we want to disengage ourselves from everything which is not top priority for us, and the top priority is the confrontation with China, which is how Europe took the action in relation to Afghanistan. So you start seeing a little bit the European member states coming together and rallying around the idea. But it's certainly true that we are going to see them going in different directions once they start analyzing what does that mean, because it means an increase in spending in terms of the budget of the European Union and relinquishing control that some of them would find it very difficult to do. And also they come from very different strategic positions. I think that this move to the East is creating a big crack in the European Union, because the interest of France in the Pacific with its Navy is something that pretty much no other EU member state shares. So far, so good that they are all moving in a similar direction, but we are going to find big disagreements once that they start looking at the details of all this. I think that, Jeff, something that has happened over the last 2 or 3 months has been a change of tone also in the relationship between the US and the UK, and much more positive. Who would have thought that Boris Johnson would find a better accommodation with Biden than with Trump, who was his big supporter? But some of the moves from the US, from the European point of view, look like the US is accommodating the UK too much, and that is seen as a bit of a provocation to the European Union. And again, if we didn't know how experienced the Biden team is, we could put it to, oh, this is the beginning of the government, but it doesn't really look like that. It looks like something more substantial.
Adam, do you?
Before
Just going to ask if Adam felt that. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Just to address Jeff's kind of put the button on it from this side of the Atlantic, so to speak, that I think the Biden administration and Democrats in general recognize the importance of Europe and of NATO. They were horrified to learn that about Trump's potential withdrawal from the NATO alliance. And that, going back to the first premise about the world is interconnected, and it really is democracies versus autocracies, that Europe plus the US equals more than, I think, 50% of the world's GDP. So if you take all and I believe Australia may be in there, rough around the edges, but I think it really magnifies the importance of democracies versus autocracies in that coordination. And yes, the pullout from Afghanistan in turning from west to east, or America's focus was messy, and the Australia subdeal, the execution of it was messy, but we seem to be on better terms now. But there are going to be bumps in the road. I mean, we've had U.S. felt strongly about Nord Stream. The U.S. feels strongly about Chinese telecommunications equipment in Europe. I think Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman, or a Republican and Democrat, just introduced a bill to finance getting rid of Chinese telecommunications equipment in European 5G networks. So there are going to be rough edges, but the overall importance of Europe is still there in both competing with China and in commerce with China. But given the tension that Europe still wants to do more business with China and forego some of the security implications under the umbrella of U.S. national security, there will be, of course, tensions there. We haven't even brought Russia into play, but that magnifies the importance of NATO and the NATO alliance. Situations like Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic republics, all that is of quintessential importance.
There's a question from the audience that I'd like to put to both of you. And it follows up on what both Adam and Miriam have been talking about it. The current US-France tensions, while Germany is forming its government and figuring out what its positions are going to be, Germany has always, as Miriam noted, been sort of the peacemaker. And given that France is kind of the main player in the EU right now, how are the current US-France tensions going to impact all of these issues until Germany can return, which is going to need to do because the EU presidency is coming up?
Thank you, Melissa. Perhaps I can start from that European point of view. I don't think that we are going to see in the coming weeks tensions between the French and German position. We just have a vacuum until the Germans can sort out what kind of coalition they have going forward. But I think that it is right. I mean, the question is absolutely right that something that has happened over the last 2 years is that the European Union is just France and Germany. Nothing else counts in the European Union. There is a tiny bit of influence from Draghi, but no other member state, which leads to a lot of internal frustration, of course, but no other member state manages to have any influence on the key positions. I think that in relation to China, the positions of France and Germany are much less different than it is perceived from the US side. Remember that Angela Merkel, the amount of times that she went to China, it was unprecedented for a president that was so focused on the domestic agenda. It was a big signal that she wanted to have the engagement with China. And it was during the German presidency that she pushed for that agreement, that investment agreement that was seen as the provocation from Biden, doing something unprecedented, which was to announce an agreement before it was actually properly ready. So I think that there is not so much of a gap between both. The worry, I mean, certainly from my side, the worry is that France, even though they are in similar positions at the end of the day, the narratives and the tone from France is quite aggressive at times. That is what Germany brings. It brings a different tone in the relations, even if the substance is very similar. But I also have no doubt that if the result of the elections go towards the Social Democrats, which seems today to be the possible winning bet going forward, I think that there would be a lot of sympathy for the Macron line that Europe needs the strategic autonomy and that we should start looking at some instruments to try to get that area of competence into the EU. I think that if we end up with Laschet, it's probably more difficult to get there. But, with a Macron, if Macron survives, that we still don't know. But if you end up with Macron and the Social Democrats in power in Germany, it is quite possible that finally flies. Yeah.
Adam,
Yeah,
do you have
well,
anything? Okay.
Yeah, Miriam's response was, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. The U.S. relationship with France is and will be enduring. I think there's a famous U.S. kind of morning TV personality that said, yeah, the execution wasn't great, but we're going to have to do a make good with France. So what do you make it up with? I think Joe Scarborough said that. So what do you make? That hasn't been announced yet, but you could tell that relations are already kind of warming up. My former boss and good friend Senator Chris Coons is chair of the French caucus, the French-U.S. caucus. So I'm a little bit of a ringer on this, a little bit of a partisan regarding French-U.S. relations. Also, I would be remiss to say that every day when walking to the Senate floor, senators are reminded of France because there are these beautiful Sèvres vases or vases that are right at the entrance to the Senate floor, and those are the pride and joy of our oldest alliance with France. There's a similar bust of Winston Churchill in the Capitol that Prime Minister Johnson was very famous. I think 2 days ago there was a great picture of him with the bust of Winston Churchill. I noticed that it's in a very prominent place, and those two places are really prized. So from the symbolism of the U.S. Capitol to the substance of U.S., European, French, German, British relations, those relations are enduring. Although the recent execution of policy may have had some footfalls. That's kind of where I would go with that.
And Melissa, can I add a tiny bit there, because I think that brings us very directly into the position and the relationship between the US and the UK and how that has changed. I think that's something that is not sufficiently well perceived from the US side, is that it is not possible to defend now from the European point of view. We are going to have a very strong relationship with France, and we are also going to have a very strong relationship with the UK, because the UK and the European Union are being seen as competing in the international scene. So somehow, whenever the US let things happen, like Boris Johnson announcing that he's going to try to get into the new NAFTA, so that everybody understands the USMCA agreement, the Canada-Mexico-US agreement, and he's going to apply to that. And there is no immediate response to that, saying, well, that is not the forum for the UK. That counts in Europe. So I think that part of what we are seeing is that the international relations are becoming much more triangular. And whenever you touch on one place, obviously it has repercussions on others, when in the past we simply could afford to have some of the tantrums that we have had in the transatlantic relationship and simply, let it go, because there were lots of touch points in that relationship. Now the US takes any gestures towards China as a provocation from the EU, and in the EU, they take any gestures towards the UK as a provocation for the EU. And I think that is what is explaining a lot of that unhappiness in the symbols from both sides.
And that helps with frame COP26, the ultimate international climate change policy, which is, so that's how President Biden has framed his domestic policies. I kind of gave a macro through, but also internationally. With the Green Party in Germany, the environmental movements both in France and the UK. So how does the Biden administration work with foreign governments to further policies combating climate change? And how do you work with your European allies to convince China to adjust its behavior to combat climate change? They're one of the biggest coal producers, for example. So how do you combat that? How do you mitigate, ameliorate that, or get China on board and to try and get them. So that'll be a fascinating aspect of COP26. And what Miriam was also saying about triangulation, going west, not east, I believe China made a bid to enter the new TPP a couple of days ago or last week. So that's absolutely fascinating. The whole point of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to counter China, and now they want to enter the TPP. So this is China's trying to, now they may not be able to get into the new TPP because of some internal problems that they have that we could theoretically get into at another seminar, but it's fascinating that China kind of wants to enter the world order or enter the TPP in order to co-opt the new Trans-Pacific Partnership. But it's just interesting that the triangulation both happens both east and west, and how that's occurring. So it's just fascinating.
That's correct. I don't think that they are going to manage to get into the TPP. As just incidentally, that is one of the agreements that the UK wants to join, and they have formally applied to join for very different reasons to China, because the UK is betting that the US will come back to that agreement, and they see it as their only route for having an agreement with the US. But I think that this totally unexpected, actually, move from China saying that they want to join the agreement goes back to something that you said earlier, Adam, which is that a lot of the strategy from the US is about preventing China from taking power in the international scene. Now here we have this kind of weird situation that we are finding that there is a strain in the transatlantic relationship because of that strategy of the US ultimately, and a different strategy from the EU. But as the US disengages itself from many different areas with the objective of liberating resources to focus pretty much exclusively on China, of course they are leaving vacuums. And one of the vacuums is on trade. So what we are not finding anymore is a China that is simply observing and on the defensive. They are taking actions. I don't think that they are going to get this one, but it's a very daring move, and it's kind of saying the Pacific, on trade is our area, not only the US area.
I want to turn we only have about 10-15 minutes left, and what can international businesses, our clients, our potential clients, any client, do in light of this morass of problems worldwide right now to ensure each company's stability? That's a very open-ended question, and so you can answer it any way you want, and whoever wants to go first can go first.
I'll try one because I'm neither of the experts. I think a lot of it does depend on your specific area. There are specific rules on IT, for example, which I think Miriam and Adam pointed out. Obviously, antitrust, Melissa, which you know very well, is a hot issue as governments change and large companies become ever larger. Certain other specific things have their own thing. Say oil and gas is now a huge thing, and it is tied into environmental and COB. So I think it's hard to separate out what's relevant to a specific client to these general themes.
Well, actually, Jeff, while I have you, you're a securities and financial law expert. You represent fund managers and hedge funds and issuers of securities. What are you counseling your clients in general about how to navigate these torrid waters?
That's interesting. So far, I don't think we've seen kind of protectionism or growth in trade specifically focused on financial markets. Somehow that was kind of old news because of the financial crisis, where they really did focus a lot on that. In the last few years, I haven't really seen, it seems like the system is okay. EU put its whole new financial system in order after the financial crisis, as did the US, and that's still been playing out. But I actually haven't seen any specific developments where there seems to be more protectionism or more openness to international finance in particular.
I can tell you that in the antitrust.
Sorry.
Okay. Go ahead, Mary.
Can I pick up on that? Because I think that Jeff is absolutely right. It depends from sector to sector. The only thing that applies to all sectors is that this is a moment where we are seeing much more movement on the trade and international relations side than in the past few years. So normally the world goes through, business as usual, and then suddenly all the pieces move, and we are in that period of all the pieces move. So whatever the area of your business, I think that keeping an eye on how pieces are moving is absolutely essential, because what we are going to see is an even further increase of the defensive measures on trade. So we are going to continue seeing more anti-dumping. We are going to continue seeing more export controls. We are going to continue seeing more tariffs. We are going to see how the countries play with regulation to go into that more protectionist and defensive side, for example, on antitrust. So the watching and being ready, which is what we do for clients, becomes particularly important. And I think that regulatory field is essential. We don't see it as much on financial services, as Jeff says, because a lot of work was done on the international regulation after the 2008 crisis. So that is kind of a safe haven, so to speak. But we definitely will start seeing it more and more in some of the other areas, and on digital and tech is already there on the table. We have the US and the EU negotiating right now on the privacy shield with the European Court, saying that the way in which the US wants to have access to the data as a government and for the intelligence side, it is not okay for the conditions that the EU wants. And we could see some repercussion of that, that needs a lot of goodwill to try to bring that to a safe port. And it is far from clear that if we see more and more disagreements internationally, that we will find the goodwill on all sides. So it is the watching it, being ready, and being ready to act to protect your business from some of those measures. I think that is what is important going forward.
And thanks, Miriam. Again, that's a perfect lead into what clients tell me, which is generally, I'm so frustrated by Washington. Just tell me the rules of the road. Just tell me stability. I just want to know to do financial planning and business planning. What are the rules of the road? And so that seeking of stability in tremendously uncertain times, we haven't even talked about COVID, but that uncertainty and trying to navigate clients to help them understand the rules of the road, to navigate them to where they want to be. Or if the road doesn't lead to where they want to go, to pave a road, to help them pave a road for where they want to go, or to help, to use my rules of the road example, to help the authorities, whether it be, my rules of the road example, the road builders, the cops, the streetlight people, to build the architecture for their rules of the road. That is all things that government relations can accomplish and help in answering the basic question of, I just want to run a business. What are the rules in this? My business is not to understand Washington. I just want to run whatever business it is, whether it's IT, lobsters, making blueberry pies, whatever it may be, just help me understand. And so we try and translate that for businesses to better operate themselves.
On the antitrust side, there's a lot of activity in the tech world and also in the healthcare world. And I echo everything everybody has said, that I tell my clients to get out ahead of it. Problem is, because the rules are different depending on whether you're in the EU or the UK or South US, get out in front of so many different governing bodies. It can be laborious. And I often will advise clients that we need to be in touch with our government relations and our international trade people, because just to try to streamline, what are the common denominators? Because there are certain of the rules, big picture, that are very similar. And if you want to take the most conservative approach and make sure that you are staying on the right side of every jurisdiction, the way to do that is to make sure you understand what the rules of the road are. So. Other questions from the audience? Oh, I don't see any. Adam, let me focus on some US questions just in the last couple minutes we have. We've been talking about what's happening now. After everything gets done, what are some of the government relations opportunities for the future?
Thanks, Melissa, for the question. As I noted, there's a lot of legislative activity now, but when it's over, what's going to happen post January? Congress is about to undergo its appropriation process, funding process for fiscal year 23, starting October 1st, 2022. So that process takes a while to develop and cook. So companies are already leaning forward and planning how to get the request in if they want funding for projects next year, or really almost a year from now. And that there's some lead time in that to laying the ground and seed work. There's also going to be tons of opportunities, grants, government regulations, and so on flowing from all these bills that are coming out. We're about to spend essentially $1 trillion in one bill. And generally the thinking is around $2 trillion in another bill. So $3 trillion of spending. So how will that spending be accomplished? Who's going to get that money? How is that going to, and then on the revenue side, because there'll be a lot of revenue associated with that, not just in personal and corporate income tax increases and potentially capital gains increases, but other revenue increases. So what are the regulatory hurdles, and how to take advantage and protect yourself against some regulatory happenings that occur as a result of both these bills? That and all the other governmental functioning that may enable companies to take advantage of the situation and protect themselves from ongoing events. COVID is still a real, it's a real factor out there. Whether this is the Delta variant is the last variant to affect us, no one knows. There's I'm not Dr. Fauci, but there's the Mu variant, and there are other variants out there. So will those variants seek rises and falls just like other variants? So there certainly is a lot out there other than the immediate legislative activity of the trees from the forest. And that's what companies would advise companies to do, to both see the trees and the forest. So thanks for that question. It's a great question.
Miriam, on the international trade side, what do you see? What's your prognostication?
Well, I think that in terms of the interest for clients in relation to the European Union, the EU is going to continue working mostly on two sets of proposals, the environmental proposals, that we will see them much more linked to what is happening internationally, but then the digital proposals, and that is making a lot of progress through the internal EU machinery. I think that is what explains a bit of the comments that you were making earlier about competition being used differently. To a big extent, that has been because there wasn't regulation in this new sector, and in particular in relation to tech companies. All that the EU could do was through competition. Now it is moving towards regulation, and that huge package on tech legislation is super innovative internationally. Nobody is going as far as the EU is going there. And then the final leg there is the relation with the UK. I think that many US companies in particular who have business in the European Union do it both in the EU and the UK. That relationship is far from safe. There are lots of possible hiccups, and being watchful about it and seeing the impact of all those proposals on your products and your services is what we can help you with.
Well, we're coming up on the hour. Jeff, do you have any final comments?
I think if you read the paper every day, there's some crisis everywhere, it seems like. But there are, as Miriam said, other trends that do play out over time and do affect what happens despite the daily up and downs. So at these G7s, the people do get together and a message is delivered. In this case, Miriam said it was not the usual type of message, but each person took something away and then they work from that, then the next one come along. So it's important to try to think of those trends as the background for what should happen, while also noting that different things come up any day, which pushes things off.
Well, with that, unless there are other questions from the audience, wait, let me just see.
We'll do Harry and Meghan another day, so we can.
That's right. I think if there's one thing that I've come away with is that the EU and the United States and the UK are all trying to cooperate as best as they can, because we have mutual interest in making sure that the planet continues to spin on its axis and doesn't blow up. But I hope that the audience comes away with the understanding that our team, our international relations team, and our government relations team here at Cohen & Gresser are well equipped to help you out with any of your business problems that involve government entities, and we would welcome the opportunity to talk to you. And with that, I think it's been an hour. Thank you very much, Miriam and Adam, Jeff, for a great discussion, very informative and enlightening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all as well.
Thank you all and have a good day. Thank you. DC and London office.